the Bible. Yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God, the Bible.
The Bible. Yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word.
Hey, Bob, what are you doing?
Nothing. Just cleaning up a little.
This week, I was sitting in a room with 5 incredible people, and we were talking about the Bible. And I asked them this question. I said, hey, what's been your experience when it comes to the Old Testament? And their answers were just, I think really captured a lot of what we feel. In fact, the first person sat in that room and they said, well, my first exposure to the Old Testament was when I was a teenager. And I remember I was sitting on my top bunk and I decided to open the Bible in the Old Testament and start reading. And he said, the more I read, the harder it became. And eventually he said it was like somebody trying to spoon feed me broccoli. I mean, can you get that picture in your mind? And I was like, yeah. I mean, that would be hard. And then the other person kind of pipes up and they said, what is the Old Testament all about? Like, why do we even read it? Like, what's the point of the Old Testament? And then somebody else said, she said, hey, when I grew up, my kind of first exposure to the Old Testament, she said, is my parents, they played the Bible on tape in my home. When's the last time you guys listened to anything on tape? And that kind of was like, dated it. And so she said her parents listened to the Bible on tape, and anytime it got to the Old Testament, she said, I just completely fell asleep. Like Sunday afternoon watching golf, kind of that same feeling, right? She said that was it for me. It was just so incredibly boring. So my question for you is this, is imagine if you were in that room and imagine if we were talking about the Bible and I asked you that same question. And I just said, hey, what's been your experience when it comes to the Old Testament? What do you think about it? I think for some of you, you would agree with, what you heard. I think for some, you would go, well, what's the point or what's this whole thing about? I think for others of you, you go, I just don't understand it. I've tried, but it doesn't seem sequential, doesn't seem chronological, like I can't put all the pieces. It's just confusing. I think for some of you, you may say, I love the Old Testament. I have the context of the Old Testament, and I love reading it. I think for some, that's probably a smaller group of people, you would say that. And I think for others, if you're honest and you're here today, or you're watching or listening online, I think you would say, well, the Old Testament is the reason why I'm not a Christian. Or the Old Testament is one of the reasons why, I've considered walking away from or stepping away from Christianity. In fact, this week, I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts by Joe Rogan, and I'm not sure if you're a big podcast listener. If you like Joe, I would just say use some caution a little bit. But anyways, Joe had a guy on several weeks ago by the name of Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins, he's a brilliant thinker, just a really energetic guy, very enthusiastic fella, and he's retired he was a professor at Oxford University. He's a evolutionary biologist, and he's written a couple books. His best-selling book is called The God Delusion. It's sold over 3 million copies, and he just a lot of really interesting things that he writes in that book. And he just wrote his new book is called Outgrowing God, and it's this idea that he really wanted to target 10-year-olds, but his publisher said, no, you got to raise that age up. So he targeted 15-year-olds, and he just said, my whole goal with this book is to just kind of get rid of religion. In fact, his ultimate dream, he said on the podcast, is to see a world completely void of all religion. That's his dream. And all throughout this podcast, and I've listened to Richard before, is, Richard just kept talking about the Old Testament, the Old Testament, the Old Testament, the Old Testament. This is why, I think it's ridiculous, because the Old Testament. In fact, in his book called The God Delusion, to sum it up, here's what he said. He said, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. And he goes on to talk about the creation account. He goes on to talk about, the laws and, how archaic they are. And he makes all these points. And at the end of it, he basically said, it's just fiction. It's just nonsense. And maybe you're here today, and if you're brutally honest or watching or listening, maybe you would say, I kind of lean in that direction. When it comes to Christianity, when it comes to the whole Jesus thing, perhaps the reason you aren't, or perhaps the reason that you're considering walking away is because of something in this old book called the Old Testament. So, with that said, here's what I want to do today. For those of you here today that you when you think about the Old Testament, you go, hey, it's boring, or it's not relevant, or I don't get it, or why do we read the Old Testament? For those of you here today who you've got some honest questions about the Old Testament, or for those of you here today who just love it, you love reading it, for every single one of us, what I want to do is I want to talk about something today that I think will help all of us walk out of the room and just clear up a lot of this confusion when it comes to the Old Testament. And my hope today, if you love the Old Testament, that you'll love it even more as you walk out. And if you have questions about the Old Testament, or really the purpose of it and what's kind of the point, especially today, my hope is to clear up that confusion and bring some clarity to that. So with that said, I do want to just kind of preface one quick thing. Is today I'm going to cover a little over 2,000 years of history in about 25 minutes. So that's going to be difficult, and I know you're probably going to have questions. So if you have questions about what we're talking about today, and you're like, well, what about this? And you didn't cover this, or, I've got more questions here, or just questions about the Bible. I really want to encourage you to go to npaustin.com/Bible. You can ask your honest questions there. And then midweek, I'm doing a podcast, and I'm taking your questions, and to the best of my ability, I'm trying to answer those questions. In fact, if you haven't listened to our 2 previous podcasts, that would be a great idea. I want to encourage you to do that, because people are asking some really honest and kind of thought-provoking, a little bit polarizing questions. So don't forget to ask your questions there. So with that said, today to begin this discussion about the Old Testament, here's what I want to do. I want you to use your imagination and go back to the first century. And I want you to think about, at the end of the first century, there's all these followers of Jesus Christ. There's these Greek followers of Jesus Christ, these Roman followers of Jesus Christ, these Jewish followers of Jesus Christ, and they're all in the same room, and they are worshiping Jesus, which was radical. I mean, it's radical because previous to this, their identities were in Judaism. Their identity, I'm a Roman. Their identity was in Marduk or whoever. And so now you have, at the end of the first century, all these people saying, hey, that was my previous identity. But this guy named Jesus Christ has invited me into a new identity. And there is such unity. They're all together. And they're worshiping Jesus Christ. And they have brand new identities. It's just amazing to think about. Now, part of the group that was, at the end of the first century, of non-Jewish people, they were called Gentiles. Again, Gentiles, a non-Jewish person. When Gentiles, at the end of the first century, or kind of during the first century, when Gentiles became enamored with one particular Jew, that would be Jesus, they also became enamored with the sacred Jewish text. Because up until this point, before they put their faith in Christ, I mean, they weren't interested in the Jewish text. In fact, between Jewish individuals and Gentiles, non-Jewish individuals, there was such animosity before Jesus Christ. I mean, it was like they could not stand one another. It's like a Texas fan versus an OU fan. You guys ever seen that play out? In fact, this year was the first time I ever got to go to the Texas OU football game. And I remember the morning of the Texas OU game, I wake up and I put all my UT stuff and I'm wearing it proud. And I get in the elevator and I'm going down, we're getting ready to go to the game. And it stops at one of the floors and I look out and it opens and there's all these, OU fans and all their OU stuff. And I'm thinking, how's this all going to work out? They're walking in, and they walk in, and instead of kind of standing in these positions, they go directly to the opposite wall, and I'm standing there, and I'm looking at them, and there was just like this, standoff, this kind of look. I'm like, oh, wow. And that tension, I could feel it. Well, that same kind of tension, certainly in a different context, existed in the first century between Jewish people and non-Jewish people called Gentiles. And so Gentiles would never, ever, ever think of reading these ancient, sacred Jewish texts. But when they became followers of Jesus, they were curious. And the reason why they were curious is because they wanted the background. They wanted kind of the backdrop of how Jesus came into this world. And they heard, or they were learning, that this Old Testament had this kind of context. And so they began to read it. And they, started the Old Testament where you would start. If I said, hey, go read the Old Testament today, you would go, okay, I'm going to start at the very beginning. And they opened the letter of Genesis. And here's what they started with. They said, in the beginning. And Moses writes this. These are the words, in the beginning. Now, if you've grown up in church, or if you've been around Christianity or around church kind of world for a while, I mean, you've heard this a million times. And oftentimes you're like, yeah, let's move on, Buck. Let's go to something with substance, right? But we have to pause here because this is such a big, big deal. One of the reasons it's a big deal is because imagine these Gentiles in the first century. I mean, what they had heard their whole life is in the beginning, the gods, from a very pluralistic framework. This is a monotheistic like framework. This is the Hebrew God. In the beginning, God, I'm just telling you guys, that was brand new to them. The other reason why this is so significant and why we've got to just pause a second is because when it comes to the Old Testament and when it comes to kind of pushing back, perhaps the most common, pushback to the Old Testament is really with Genesis. And there's really two major pushbacks when it comes to Genesis. The first has to do with the creation account. And this may be new to you because in the academic world, you hear this debate a lot. In fact, Richard Dawkins on the Joe's podcast, he was pushing on this quite hard. But the first kind of pushback to the letter of Genesis is that it's like any other ancient creation account. In fact, there's thought to go, actually, the Hebrew creation account, the Genesis creation account that Moses wrote, that actually was borrowing from the Babylonian creation account. And like the Egyptian creation account or, the Canaanite creation account or the Greek or with Marduk or whoever it may be, all these creation accounts, they're all the same. And it's really clear that there is no distinctive from the letter of Genesis. They're all the same thing. That's one pushback. And if you haven't heard of that, perhaps, the reason why it's important is because your son or daughter will eventually hear that from their English professor or from the biology professor. That's a predominant pushback. The second pushback is all around creation. Like, the letter of Genesis, 6 days, is it literal days? How does that match up with science? How do we even think about that? Because it sounds so primitive. It sounds a little bit ridiculous, especially with the objective truths we know today in science. So how do you reconcile those? And those are fair pushbacks. So what I want to do, just for a brief second, is I want to try to tackle those, or I want to try to begin a conversation with both of those. So the first one is this, is that, Genesis is like any other creation account. So if somebody was to say that, one of my questions is right off the bat is, have you read the creation accounts? Because if you've read the Babylonian creation account, or if you've read the Egyptian creation account, or if you've read the Canaanite, or if you've read the Roman, whatever one you read, when you read it, you're like, oh my gosh, these are radically, radically different. And here's what I've got to, here's one of the things that I think is a fair pushback, is that all these creation accounts, they do have some similarities. They talk about the land. They talk about the people. They talk about the animals. They talk about, the stars and the galaxies. And of course they would, because that's what you would talk about in creation. But here's what's so important. There's a logical fallacy that happens all the time in terms of rules of logic. And the logical fallacy is this, is just because two things have one thing or two things or three things or four things in common, it doesn't mean they're the same thing. For example, I have eyes and ears and toes, and a giraffe has eyes and ears and toes. In fact, if you didn't know, a giraffe has 4 toes. I learned that this week, right? And just because I have eyes and ears and toes, and a giraffe has eyes and ears and toes, doesn't mean that Buck Giebelhaus and a giraffe are the same thing. But that argument, hey, look they all have these same things, is used time and time again. And again, if you go back and you just read the creation accounts of these ancient creation stories, they're radically, radically different to where you would have the conclusion and say, Genesis stands in startling contrast to other ancient creation stories. Genesis is a worldview unto itself. And today I want to show you just a couple examples of that. For example, if you continue with the Genesis account, here's what you read. And this is unlike any other creation story. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image. In other words, mankind is the pinnacle of creation. It's not an afterthought of creation. If you look at all other ancient stories of creation, mankind is always an afterthought. In the Genesis account or the Hebrews account, mankind is the pinnacle, which means mankind has such worth and value and significance. You simply don't find that in other creation accounts. In addition to that, as you continue to read, it says, then God said, let us make mankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over. Now, guys, this is important because it's may rule over creation. In other words, creation, we shouldn't deify creation. We shouldn't make idols to creation. We shouldn't go, hey, here's the God of the sun and the God of the oceans and the God of all these things. I mean, in the Ten Commandments, it says, don't make any graven like image or idol. And so this is unlike any other creation account as well, because this is the idea to go, no. We are to be stewards of creation. We are not to deify creation, which is a distinctive in the letter of Genesis. And the last thing I'll show you is this, and this is so important. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, this is a big deal, and this is just my opinion. But my opinion is this. I don't understand why every single woman in the world, it doesn't at least aspire to or is not interested in becoming a Christ follower. Because when you look at Jesus Christ, he came into the world, a culture that was a very sexist culture that devalued women, and he elevated the value of women. He gave them such worth and dignity and relevance in his story, the story of the very Son of God coming into the world. It was unlike anyone before him. And then when you go to the creation account and you think of this word here, when God, described woman, when God gave a name to woman, did you know he used the same Hebrew word that he uses for himself? That he says, helper, that Hebrew word is the same thing. In other words, he's saying, hey, dignity, power, influence, the same word I use for woman is the exact same word he used for him. Now, I get some of the tension with this in that church history and some of the church leaders and the abuse, especially when it's come to women and leveraging our power for the sake. It's just, there are some bad versions of that story. And I get the pushback, but when you clear all that away and you simply go to Jesus Christ and you go to the very beginning of the Genesis account, it elevates the status of men, women, and children like no other account. It's such a distinctive creation story. And that's one of the first pushbacks. And I think that's at least important to consider. Now, the second pushback is really when it comes to the creation account. It's like, okay, here's science, here's these 6 days, here's the creation account. Do these things reconcile? And so if we're talking about that, I just think this is important to think about. In the beginning, it says God, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. Now, it took science years and years and years, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to catch up with this. Because in 1927, a Belgian priest actually came up with the idea, and this was like a breakthrough of what you're familiar with and I'm familiar with, called the Big Bang Theory. In other words, this Belgian priest said, it looks like the evidence points to a beginning. Now, that's important because up until 1927, the predominant thought was kind of Aristotle thinking. And Aristotle thinking, kind of the 4th century BC, is the idea that the universe always existed. It's always been here. But in 1927, this Belgian priest says, it really looks like it has a beginning. And then in 1964, when CMB was discovered, this cosmic microwave background, and you looked at the scientific evidence of this and the radiation, what's going on, it pointed to the fact, objective facts pointed to the fact that the universe had a beginning. And after 1964, the scientific community all kind of abandoned this view that it has always existed and that it had a beginning. Just as Moses said a long time ago, in the beginning. Now, what's really important when it comes to the creation account, and as Moses describes this in Genesis, is Moses' point is not how God created. That wasn't his point. He was writing this to a primitive group of people. Moses' point in the letter of Genesis is that God created. That in the beginning, that God created. Now, I realize this creates a whole lot of tension, especially if you're a follower of Jesus and you're like, no, here's all the how, and you get there's a lot of energy around the 6 days, and here's what all this means. And I also realize that you may be here today or watching or listening online, and you may go, well, this is one of the reasons why I'm not a Christian, because there's a lot of energy, because these things just don't reconcile. And the how, and I'm getting caught up, and there's a lot of, discussion, debate in the how. If that's the case and you have that, that kind of passion there, one of the resources I would highly recommend is by a man named John Lennox, Professor John Lennox. John Lennox is a current professor at Oxford. He's got his PhD in mathematics. He's just a brilliant thinker. I've listened to him and followed him for a long time. And he wrote a book that I would highly recommend called The 7 Days That Divide the World. He approaches it from a scientific perspective. It's a great read if you're interested in this. And his conclusion is basically to say it's not about how God created. At the end of the day, it's that God created. And again, the point of Genesis is in the beginning, God is the creator. And in the beginning, God created man and woman with incredible dignity, worth, and value. And that's where we get the golden rule from. That's where we get morality from, is the fact that you and I have such value in the eyes of our Heavenly Father. So that's the beginning of creation. And at the beginning of creation, God created a world with the capacity to love. And because the world has a capacity to love, you must give mankind freedom. And you are way more free than perhaps you have been taught. And God will not violate that freedom. And that's exactly what you see through the New Testament. In fact, as we continue the story of the New Testament, it's God, the creator, at the beginning. And then he creates mankind. He creates Abraham. And he comes to Abraham early on in the Old Testament, and he says to Abraham, I'm going to make a promise with you. And the promise that God makes Abraham is a twofold promise. He says, Abraham, I promise that through you, one day, through you, I will bless the entire world. And the second promise he makes to Abraham is he's going to make Abraham into a great nation. In fact, he says to Abraham, he says, I'm going to make your descendants so great that they're going to outnumber the stars, and they're going to outnumber the sand, like the pebbles of sand, like so vast. And that's exactly what begins to happen. In fact, time moves on, and the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, grow into a nation. Most theologians would say between 1, 2, or 3 million. And at that time, when they're at this size, they're also in slavery under Egypt. And Pharaoh is the leader, and Pharaoh has them in slavery. And that brings us to our second character, which is Moses. And Moses comes on the scene, and the Hebrew people are in slavery. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to let your people go, right? And then God gets Pharaoh's attention the only way God could have gotten his attention at that time, through power and through force. And eventually Pharaoh comes to the place to go, okay, I'll let the nation, or let the people, the Hebrew people go. And at this time, again, most theologians would say the group of Hebrew people was probably 1, 2, or 3 million people. So Moses leads the people, leads these Hebrews. As the Hebrews are leaving, the Egyptian gives them gold and silver and livestock and all this kind of prosperity. As they leave, they cross, the Red Sea, they go in, and they go to a place called Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up to the mountain. And God and Moses are interacting, and God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. God gives Moses the law. And right here, this is so important to understand when it comes to the Old Testament. The Sinai covenant is introduced. And guys, the Sinai covenant may be the most important point that we're making today. So just lean in, because this gives such context. The Sinai covenant is God's covenant between God and the people of Israel. Not you, not me, specifically between God and the people of Israel. And the covenant that God makes with the people of Israel, there's an unconditional piece and a conditional piece. The covenant is, the unconditional piece is, hey, nation of Israel, I'm going to do something through you to bless the whole world. I promise that. That's an unconditional promise that God made to the nation of Israel here. But he also had a conditional covenant. And the conditional covenant is, keep my law, obey me, and I will bless you. Keep my law and I will, increase your territory. And hey, don't give in to the customs and the cultures of the surrounding nations, because God is establishing this nation to do something in the world for the world. And he said, you obey me and don't, give in to the surrounding nations. Then I won't let the surrounding nations conquer you, and I will bless you. And that brings us to the point that gives us a lot of tension, because now we're at the law. And now you have all these 600 plus laws. And oftentimes one of the biggest pushbacks I hear on the Old Testament is these laws are so archaic. Like, these laws are so antiquated. And it's like, if God loves me, what's all the law about? What's this thing? there's a lot of pushback here. And that's fair. So I want to take one aspect. I want to just show you one example that really kind of paints the picture for a lot of the law, and hopefully this makes sense and is helpful. So I want you to think of the letter of Leviticus. Leviticus 18. Now, if you're not familiar with Leviticus, Leviticus is the third letter in the Bible. So you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, right? And if you've ever tried to read the Bible, this is exactly where you stop, I promise you. Because you read Genesis and you're like, wow, it's all beginning, and Exodus and all the adventures of Moses. And then you get to Leviticus and you're like, what is this? I mean, you just come to a screeching halt because it's a detailed account of all these 600 plus laws that God, remember, this is so important, that God is making a covenant with these laws between God and specifically the nation of Israel. And it's so confusing. And there's so much context that's required. For example, in Leviticus 18, God gives 19 sexual prohibitions. And all 19 of these sexual prohibitions he gives in Leviticus 18 are exactly what the surrounding nations are doing. So all these nations are doing these, these 19 things. But he looks at Israel and he says, guys, you're to be a nation that's set apart. That I'm going to do something in the world, for the world, through you. So I want you to be set apart. Now, when we hear that, we go, oh, this is exactly why I'm not a Christian. Or this is exactly why I don't read the Old Testament. Because these things are so archaic. I mean, this is just ridiculous. I mean, God, just get out of the bedroom, perhaps, right? There's a pushback to that. But again, my question is always this. Do you know what these laws are? Do you know the context? Do you know what these 19 things are? Because here's what's really important to know. Today, in all developed countries, 17 of the 19 behaviors prohibited in Leviticus are illegal or frowned upon today. In other words, you go to the United States of America and all developed nations, 17 of the 19, we would go, oh my gosh, that's either illegal or you should never do that. Because if you were to summarize Leviticus 18 and say, what are all these laws about? I mean, Moses tells us. He says, no one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. Now, I don't think I got to explain that. I think we always say, yes, that's a bad idea, right? And that's why I would say context is so incredibly, incredibly important when it comes to the Mosaic law or to the laws. For example, context of what's going on in their culture, context of what's happening medically, context to what's happening in terms of, where they're at in geography. All that context is important. And one kind of side note example of this is in the Old Testament, oftentimes this is brought up, it says not to get tattoos, the simple version. And people are always like, oh, that's why I shouldn't get a tattoo because the Bible says, the Old Testament, again, the Old Testament is a covenant between God and the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, not you and me, the people of Israel. But context is important because when you were getting tattoos in the Old Testament, it was causing infections. People were dying from these. And so God, because he loves the people and leaned in their direction, he says, hey, that's a bad idea. Again, context is so important. And if you were to take the law and kind of have a summary statement, here's what the summary statement would be. A moral and civil code that when understood in its ancient context is brilliant. Just as a loving father, just as a good father always accommodates to the capacity of his kids, right? If you have a 5-year-old, a 15, and a 25-year-old, and a 5-year-old asks you where do babies come from, and the 15-year-old and 20, that'd be weird for a 15 and 25, but just go with me. But if that was the case, you would come to the 5-year-old and you would explain this, and you would explain it one way. You would explain where babies come from a different way to your 15-year-old, and you would explain it radically different if you had a 25-year-old medical student, right? It's all you accommodate their capacity. And all throughout the Old Testament, when it comes to the law, that's exactly what God does because God is a loving Father. So, let's jump back to the Old Testament. So you have Abraham, and you have Moses, and then you have the Sinai covenant, and the nation of Israel then crosses the Jordan River. And they go and they establish themselves as a nation, and they begin to prosper. And now the nation, they want kings. And the people, and this was a tension because God was their king. And the people of Israel looked around at the surrounding nations and go, but they have kings and they have kings. We want a king. And God's like, I'm your king, and I've established judges to kind of continue my laws and establish this nation. You don't need a king. But God will not violate that freedom. And so he gave them a king. And when the nation of Israel got kings, kings did what kings do. They did whatever they want, whenever they want, with whomever they want. And you read the story of the kings of Israel, and there are some fabulous things, but you also read how this kind of cycle of disobedience and what happens and just where they lead the nation of Israel. And so now you have kings. And then in addition to that, you have the temple. And now the temple comes on the scene. And again, this is what kings wanted. The kings wanted the temple because they looked at the surrounding nations and they saw the surrounding nations with their gods. They had temples. And they're like, we want a temple. Now, what was different about the Hebrew temple, or what was different about this temple, is that this temple didn't have an image of God. You see, all other temples had the image of the God that they worshiped. In this temple, there wasn't. In fact, in 63 BC, just an example of this, Pompey, a Roman military leader, comes in, conquers Jerusalem. He goes into the Jewish temple, and he's excited to finally see the image of the Jewish God. And he goes into the Holy of Holies. He pulls the curtain back, and he walks into the Holy of Holies. And he's shocked because he just sees some kind of plates and stuff and some gold things. And he doesn't find an image of the Hebrew God. And that's because of the 10 Commandments. It said not to make a graven image. And so God says, I am who I am. You can't capture me in an image. So now we have the temple. And then in the Old Testament, we have the prophets. And the prophets come on the scene because the kings do what kings do. And the nation of Israel would rebel. And when the prophets come on the scene, the prophets are the ones that would weep. The prophets are the ones that would, you would see them yelling. They would tell the nation of Israel, they would tell the kings, come back to God. Trust God. Because of the Sinai covenant. Now, the other things prophets would do, and this was fairly rare, but this is what they would do, is prophets would not only tell the nation of Israel to go back to God, but sometimes prophets would reach into the future. Prophets would reach several hundred years and say, hey, that's what God's going to do. One day this is what God's going to do, and I'm going to prophesy about it. Perhaps one of the greatest examples of this is a prophet by the name of Isaiah. Isaiah is perhaps the most popular prophet. And Isaiah does this move where he reaches in hundreds and hundreds of years into the future and says, this is what will happen. An example of this is in Isaiah 53. And imagine this. The Israelites are hearing this for the very first time. And Isaiah is prophesying this. And here's what he says. He says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, to which the Israelites are going, what are you talking about? Who's he? What is this he? What are you getting at, Isaiah? He goes, hang on. He continues. He said, but he was pierced. Pierced? Who is this? He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Isaiah, that's what the temple's all about. That's what the animal sacrifice is all about. They take our iniquities. They are crushed for our transgressions. Who is this he? And what's this piercing about? And then Isaiah continues, and he says, the punishment that brought us peace, it was on him. And by his wounds, you're healed. In other words, by this his wounds, you can have peace with God. Isaiah, that's radically different than anything we've ever been taught about the temple and the sacrificial systems to give us peace with God. And Isaiah continues and says this, for he was cut off from the land of the living. He's going to die. For the transgressions of my people, he was punished. And then he says this. He says, he was assigned a grave. He's going to die and he's going to be buried. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor is any deceit in his mouth. In other words, he didn't sin. This he was perfect. And imagine being an Israelite. This is 650 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. Going, what are you talking about? This is so different. And is that the end of the story in the grave? And Isaiah says, no, this is how the story ends. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life come back to life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. 650 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. And today, if you like, you can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls capture these Old Testament letters. The Dead Sea Scrolls are predated from the life of Jesus. This wasn't written after Jesus. we have Isaiah 53 before Jesus. And then you fast forward to the last prophet, Malachi. And Malachi says to the people of Israel, trust God, go back to God. And then lights go out. For 400 years, there's silence. In the first century, there's a man, a scholar of all scholars, who had the entire Old Testament memorized. His name was Paul. Paul came face to face with the resurrected Jesus Christ and became a Jesus follower. He was intimately familiar with these Old Testament letters. And here's what Paul says. But when the set time had fully come, when everything lined up historically as God said, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. So here you have these Gentiles in the first century, and they're curious about the backstory of Jesus. And they pick up these 39 Old Testament letters, and they begin to read them, and it's the story, it's the history of how Jesus came into the world. And they looked at these 39 letters, and they called them the Old Covenant, which would later be translated to the Latin word Old Testament. And the reason why they called them old is because they knew that these 39 letters were not a spiritual guidebook. They were history. This was written as a covenant between God and the people of Israel. And they also knew that something new had come on the scene. And what had come on the scene that was brand new is God's promise is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And now they have the letters about the life of Jesus and this new covenant between God and all of mankind, this new covenant that is an unconditional covenant through Jesus. And so they take these 27 letters of the new covenant, and they say, you know what? That history, the history of the old covenant that tells the story of how Jesus came into the world, we should connect these two things, and we should call one the Old Testament and the other this New Testament, this new covenant between God and you and me through Jesus Christ. And that's how we get the Bible. Now, the question becomes, what do we do with this? I mean, how do you take this in such a way that it's actually relevant to your life? I mean, how do you begin to actually read this? Because it's not even in chronological order. I mean, you begin to read this, it's going to be very, very confusing if you don't know the chronological order. So how do you begin to read this? And how do you apply it to your life? And how does this become something that's practical and helpful to your everyday life? Well, those are the questions we're going to answer next week. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you again for today. Thank you for the fact that you have preserved through all these years these Old Testament letters that remind us of how much you are for us and how much you love us. God, I'm grateful for that. And with the things we heard, Father, if we have questions, I just ask that you prompt us to go and ask those questions. And ultimately, the thing I'm asking you is that all of us take a step and grow in our trust and confidence in Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.